And it's interesting because I grew up on the East Coast, and then I lived in California for about 16 years. So now I feel like the middle of my life is being spent in the middle of the country, and I don't have any plans to leave. I feel that I'm probably the opposite of the quintessential image of the Nebraska writer when you think of somebody really rooted to the land, even though Willa Cather grew up on the East Coast and moved back there. Still, Mari Sandoz and these people, you think of them as very tied to the land, and I had the opposite sort of upbringing. I'm a very rootless person. This is the longest I've ever lived anywhere. I've lived in Lincoln now 3 years longer than I've ever lived anywhere else in my life. So it is creeping, Nebraska is creeping into my work. I set stories just about anywhere because I've lived a lot of places, LA, Washington, D.C., San Francisco area, now a few in Nebraska. I think it's a good counterbalance to the sort of trendiness of living on the East Coast or West Coast, which can creep into your fiction in a way that can easily, I think, make it dated or a little superficial. As you capture the trendiness of the culture, it's hard to not have your stories come across as somewhat trendy and dated. I decided really young. I was one of those people that always knew I was going to major in English, and so there was never any sort of epiphany where, oh, I think I'll be a writer. I guess it was my parents then. My mother reads a lot, and my father was an English teacher for a while until he decided he needed more money and started working for General Motors. So I'd have to say it was them, and probably particularly my mother's example of reading so much. And I was an only child for 6 years, like, I'm bored, do something with me. And she'd say, well, just wait till you can read, and then you'll never be bored again. So I took her at her word, more or less. Well, I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I had a number of teachers there who helped me in different ways. Joy Williams helped me in that I'd sold all my stuff and left California. I had an apartment, a condominium, I had furniture, and I was 33 years old, and I arrived in Iowa City, and I went into the workshop, and my first story that she read, she said, this isn't appropriate material for a story. This just isn't going to do. And I was devastated. I went in the ladies' room. I was just crushed. But then, after I got over being upset and angry, the next story I wrote ended up in an anthology. I mean, she had really sort of let me know that you can't just get away with being clever and having a certain facility. You really have to dig deep. This is something that I work with my better students on too, that some of them can write like angels, but they're not quite digging deep enough yet. So you have to bleed a little more on the page, I think. Since I usually write without a plan, it's more like I am trying to discover whatever, the story or novel, what it's about, and in rewriting to come to understand it. And whatever I've come to understand about it, I hope that the reader will also come to understand that about it. I usually just start with some sort of a relationship, and there's usually some kind of tension or state of disequilibrium that creeps into the relationship if it's not there from the start, and it's how these people work their way through some particular often difficult situation in their life. I guess I've veered more towards writing about major dramatic events. A kid drowning in a neighbor's swimming pool. In the story Crete, the narrator's family is murdered by one of the sister's boyfriends. A woman who had a mastectomy, things like that. Because I think people are fascinated really about these crisis points in our lives, and I think the trick is to try to write about them in a non-melodramatic way. It's a very fine line. Sometimes I think there's more of a risk involved than if you write about something very subtle to begin with. I guess the adjective that's been used about my writing that I've seen in reviews or people I know have mentioned that strikes a chord in me is compassion. I think that's really important, something that I try to talk to my students, my writing students, about a lot, that you have to have compassion for your characters. One of the great things about fiction is it's an opportunity to explore from the inside the mind of somebody you might not like in real life or wouldn't know in real life, but to understand how, because of the forces working upon them, how they grew up or whatever, this is why they're doing these things the way they're doing them. So I guess that would be it mostly. It's just a sort of ability to see everybody from inside their own mind in a way. I'm going to read a story called The Shadow of the Cross. I wrote it one summer when I was in Taos, New Mexico, staying at the Wurlitzer colony, which gives you a little house to write in for the summer. And I went to this church in Rancho de Taos, and it has something called the mystery painting. And I don't want to go into too much detail on that because the story goes into it, but they gave us this flyer and this slideshow and everything, and I was struck by the image, and it sort of haunted me, and I knew it was going to be an image for something. So in writing the story, it was really finding out what it was going to be an image of. I like the New Mexico landscape, and the story is about a couple and a woman friend who are traveling in New Mexico, and having been single a large part of my life, I think a lot of other women too have been in the position that there's an odd dynamic that goes on in these sorts of situations where you're the extra person and this kind of etiquette and what's really going on. And so I was exploring that, and I was just thinking tonight that I might like to write a similar story from the point of view of two men and a woman traveling somewhere. A different dynamic that would probably go on. The Shadow of the Cross. Lying in the unfamiliar bed beside his familiar sleeping wife, Evan tries to remember back to the time, not so impossibly long ago, when he did not love Delia, who is still awake, like him, in the adjacent hotel room. He can see the bright hem of light underneath the door dividing their two rooms. It seems in the darkness like some golden electrified boundary, the line between right and wrong, the line between light and darkness. He imagines that she is propped up on a nest of pillows, reading herself to sleep. All day, in between sightseeing excursions, she has been reading Death Comes for the Archbishop. Unlike him, she reads very quickly and does not comment aloud on what she is reading. Her bright, dark, bird-like eyes seem to fly over the printed words. She makes fun of the ponderous way he pores over the travel guides, underlining and starring the important tidbits of information. She calls him the graduate student, and his wife Molly laughs and nods her head. The two women love to find him ridiculous. He understands the dynamic at work here and generally plays along with good humor, the silly but beloved castrato. That's his role. Meanwhile, Molly, the wife, must act unromantic and unpossessive so that Delia, the single friend, will not feel like a third wheel. And Delia, the loose cannon, must strike just the right balance so as to suggest that she finds her friend's husband attractive. Otherwise, both the friend and the husband might take offense without actually being attracted to him. Behind the closed door, the light blinks off. Like Evan, Delia is an insomniac, and often lying restlessly awake next to Molly, his brain grinding away in the darkness. He has thought that he should have married a fellow insomniac, instead of a woman whose eyelids seem to operate like an on-off switch to her brain. In the old days, in the early years of their marriage, it was different. Molly would stay awake, whispering with him in the darkness, a kind of conversational lullaby, until sometimes he drifted off to sleep before her. But ever since Aviva, their first daughter, was born, Molly has slept like a rock, an oblivious, complacent rock, he thinks, restlessly tossing off the blanket, although usually her soft, even breathing is a source of comfort and pleasure to him. He slides gingerly out of bed, walks over to the window and pulls back the drape. In the moonlight, he can see the looming dark shape of Taos Mountain. He remembers snatches of Cather's description, which he skimmed earlier in the day at the airport when Delia left the paperback lying on the seat next to his while the two women went off to the ladies' room. In the deep, deep silence, he can almost hear the faint clopping of Bishop Latour's horse as the bishop makes his way up the dusty path toward the house of Padre Martinez, that lusty, lackadaisical excuse for a man of God. In college, the American novel from Hawthorne to Hemingway, Evan had written a paper identifying Padre Martinez as the true hero of the novel. He remembers the novel only dimly and wonders if he would see it the same way now that he is a husband and a father. The dark, ancient immovability of the mountain calms him, and he thinks maybe he can sleep. The room is chilly. As he slides back underneath the covers, Molly's warm, soft, sleeping flesh seems like a gift, as fragrant and delicious as fresh baked bread. He licks her shoulder, and she stirs slightly, as if shrugging off a fly. He does it again, and she does it again, and he smiles to himself in the darkness, happy to have reminded himself that he does, in fact, love his wife, almost as much as he loves their two daughters, Aviva and Chloe, who are staying with his parents back in L.A. for the weekend. With his eyes closed, he can see them, clear as a home movie, lying in their twin beds, sleeping the deep sleep of the innocent. The thought of doing anything to lose them sends a shiver through him, and he nestles closer to his wife's inert yet receptive flesh. As he drifts off toward sleep, the ghost of Bishop Latour materializes in the empty chair by the window. Evan breathes easier as he senses the bishop's stern, unflinching eye gazing upon him, making certain that even in his dreams he does not cross that bright golden line. The next morning, the three of them meet in the hotel lobby and walk the 4 picturesque blocks to Michael's kitchen, the description of which Evan has starred and underlined in his well-thumbed guidebook. The early morning light is so pure, so lucid, that he feels somehow relieved, as if this is not a place for murky, hidden entanglements, only bright primary relationships, wife, husband, friend, as in a children's book. A block from the restaurant, the two women pause in front of a small gallery, their attention snagged by some unusual-looking rugs. He waits patiently for a few moments while the women debate whether a particular rug would look good in Delia's bedroom, and then, like a dance partner, he places his hand lightly in the small of his wife's back. "Come on," she says, hooking her arm through Delia's. "We've got a starving man here." Both women smile indulgently, as if his appetite were something sort of crude and silly and male, like a jockstrap. But once they are actually seated in the crowded restaurant, after a 15-minute wait, both women order larger breakfasts than he does. While he eats his modest scrambled eggs and toast, they wolf down Amazonian platters of huevos rancheros, refried beans, and tortillas. Between mouthfuls, they negotiate the day's itinerary. The balance of power here is tricky. Delia, the outsider, insists on her total amenability to anything, while Molly and he gently butt heads. His wife is a great believer in spontaneity, hanging loose, what she calls playing it by ear, a phrase he has come to detest over the 9 years of their marriage. Having no talent for improvisation, he prefers the comfort of a set score. In the end, however, they generally end up doing whatever Delia wants to do, because she refuses to state her preferences, and because she is, in a sense, the guest in their relationship, they struggle to divine her true wishes and grant them. It is a form of hospitality, even though all three of them are away from home. By the time the bill finally arrives, they have agreed that they will spend the morning at the Pueblo and then drive to the D.H. Lawrence Ranch. The afternoon, they will play by ear. Evan holds the restaurant door open for the two women. Every time he walks outside, he is amazed by the place, as if his amazement were a dog he had parked outside to wait faithfully for him. After 11 years of Los Angeles smog, he thinks of Taos as a sort of Shangri-La, except for the steady stream of traffic through the center of town, which woke him at dawn. He is a sound engineer for a recording company, and his acutely developed hearing is both a blessing and a curse. Of course, the traffic in Santa Monica, where they live, is much, much worse than the traffic here, but it has a different pitch and rhythm, so familiar to him by now that he never even hears it, unless it suddenly shuts off like the hum of a refrigerator. He notices Delia's pace slow down involuntarily as they pass by the shop with the rugs, and he can feel her wanting to ask if they can stop for a minute now that the shop is open, and then deciding not to, probably because she thinks he won't want to. "Let's duck in here for a second," he says, "and check out the prices." Molly shrugs, surprised, and Delia looks away from him, as if aware that he is doing this for her. A faint smile flits across her face. Inside the shop, the two women bend over a rug, examining it more closely in a businesslike way. Molly is a part-time interior decorator, and Delia is a textile designer. They met about a year ago when Molly discovered Delia, who was just breaking into the design scene in LA after several years in Honolulu. She has an ex-husband who doesn't get mentioned much, at least not in Evan's presence, still living in Hawaii. Evan glances at the price tags on a couple of the rugs and can't believe they're serious. Still, as he surreptitiously watches Delia's delicate fingers stroking the weave and hears her disappointed sigh, it is all he can do to keep himself from whisking out his Visa card and playing the indulgent father. What he feels for her, however, is not paternal. Isn't he being a model of patience? Molly looks over at him and winks. The salesgirl laughs in a sisterly fashion, and he shrugs, a silly grin on his face, like some harmless husband in a sitcom. "Let's go," Delia says abruptly, rescuing him. Out behind the hotel, they are sitting in the car with the motor running, waiting for Molly, who has run back inside for the extra roll of film she suddenly remembered. He sits in the back seat of the rented Ford Taurus, conscious of his fuzzy bare legs stretched out on the seat. This morning when he emerged in his khaki shorts, the women teased him about his gorgeous legs. To cover his embarrassed pleasure, he pointed out that no man these days would ever dare to make such a sexist remark about a woman. They agreed that this was true, but appeared to feel no remorse. Delia sits in the passenger seat, cleaning her sunglasses, which dangle from a shocking pink cord around her neck. She holds them up close to her mouth and huffs hot breath onto the lenses, as if giving the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Then she polishes each lens with the hem of her turquoise tank top. Each steamy little huff sends a shiver right through him. Seating themselves in the car has become yet another covert exercise in diplomacy. When Delia makes a beeline for the back seat, Molly protests, offering various excuses to avoid ending up in the conventional gestalt: husband in driver's seat, wife in passenger seat, friend in back seat. "I feel like driving," Molly would say, or "Let Evan sit in the back so he can stretch his legs. Do you mind?" The fierce sun beats down on the car and sweat starts to trickle inside his t-shirt, but he feels no real impatience for Molly to return. The radio plays Spanish pop music. Unlike the two women, who are fairly fluent, he doesn't understand a word of Spanish. He feels a vestigial flicker of anger from last night, the one time he has lost his cool thus far. Tired from the flight and the long drive up from Albuquerque, they were sitting out on the patio at Ogilvy's after dinner, drinking blue margaritas. They were all fairly smashed by this point, and the two women had started chattering away in Spanish, pretending to be talking about him, hamming it up until he had stood up abruptly and stormed off to the men's room. When he returned, they apologized. The guilty look on their faces and their obvious desire to behave reminded him of his daughters, and he melted immediately. "Would you like me to change the station?" Delia asked politely. Her hand dangles over the back seat, almost grazing his bare knee. All 6 feet and 1 inch of bodily sensation are abruptly focused in his right knee. He is hypnotized by the languid sway of her fingers. He feels as if he is back in high school. He hates it and loves it. "No," he says, "it's fine." Delia shrugs and nudges the air conditioning up a notch. The real agony is in not knowing what Delia feels. Sometimes he is certain that this madness is mutual, that they are both locked into a terrible, frozen passion. What is so terrible, he thinks, besides the obvious guilt, is that it can last forever precisely because it is frozen. This passion, unlike most passions, cannot melt away or burn itself up. He remembers those rock stars in the 60s who used to have plaster casts made of their erections. He thinks he may be doomed to go through life with a permanent emotional, if not physical, erection. Other times he thinks the whole thing's stupid. It's all in his own mind and hormones. Delia is completely innocent, clueless, as his older daughter would say. If Delia knew what he was thinking and feeling, she would be furious with him for ruining a lovely, light-hearted friendship. Sometimes he thinks maybe he should just get it off his chest, confess to her like a naughty little boy, and try to proceed as if this were just a silly adolescent crush, which in fact it may be. But something always stops him. He's not sure exactly what. He's not sure of anything anymore. It could be loyalty to Molly, he thinks, but more likely it is the fear that Delia will say she feels the same way he does. And then what? Delia leans over and punches in a different radio station. He thinks about leaning forward and switching off the ignition to save gas, but he feels somehow safer with the motor running. The best evidence to support his theory that his passion is not totally unrequited is how silent they get whenever Molly leaves them alone for more than a minute. The joking drops away. Around Molly, they are like two old friends, but alone together, they become strangers. Their silence seems to expand inside him, the pressure building until he thinks it might blow a hole through his chest. He rolls the window down, then back up, as if to let something in or out. Here she comes, finally. Delia pats his knee as she waves to Molly running across the parking lot, her Nikon suspended from her neck like a third eye. Sorry, Molly slides in breathlessly behind the wheel. Here. She yanks the camera strap over her head and hands Evan the Nikon. As she puts the car in gear, they all start to talk at once. Molly sails out of the parking lot and turns right, with no need to consult a map. After college, she lived with her painter boyfriend in Santa Fe for a year, and she seems to remember her way around the area as if it were yesterday. It was she who suggested this trip one evening at El Coyote, when somehow they got onto the subject of New Mexico, and Delia confessed she had never been and had always wanted to go. Evan's never been there either, Molly said, unwrapping her steaming green corn tamale. We should go there, the three of us. Why not? And here they are. Hearing conversation from the back seat is difficult, so Evan entertains himself by focusing the camera on one woman's face and then the other's back and forth as if he were filming a tennis match. The two women could be sisters. They are both dark, tanned, lean, not at all out of place in this geographical context. He suspects that some narcissistic attraction is at the basis of their friendship, since people often comment on the resemblance. He also suspects that this is part of his attraction to Delia. He feels that he already knows her, but not quite. Looking at her, he sees many of the same obvious physical charms that drew him to Molly in the first place, without all the inevitable, irritating little habits that start to grate on your nerves day in and day out over the years. Somehow Delia is more like the way Molly was before he got to know her so well. She is tuned into him in the way Molly was before she got to know him so well. Sometimes he can feel her listening to him when he speaks. He can feel her watching him as she walks across the room, whereas Molly has seen and heard it all before, or at least that's the impression she gives, oblivious complacency. He imagines that making love to Delia would be the best of both worlds, all the comforts of home plus the thrill of a foreign port. He sighs and puts the lens cap back on the camera. Here we are, Molly says, pointing to a dusty cluster of adobe buildings that he recognizes from countless paintings and postcards. At the entrance is a sort of toll booth. Molly stops the car and rolls down the window, smiling her irresistible smile. An unsmiling Indian man says the entrance fee is $5. Delia immediately grabs her wallet and pulls out a $5, but Molly waves it away, taking instead the bill that Evan proffers from the back seat. It's another $5 if you want to take pictures, the man says, frowning at the Nikon. Evan groans and Delia nods her head in agreement. Molly, a photo fanatic, hesitates. Both Evan and Delia kid her about being part Japanese, and then reluctantly says, we'll leave the camera in the car. Delia gives her a supportive pat on the back, and Evan lets out a sigh of relief. All along, he has had this worry, probably completely irrational, that when the snapshots are developed, they may reveal something to his wife that she has failed to pick up on. Since she is an avid photographer, most of the pictures tend to be of Delia and him in front of various scenic backdrops. Pictures don't lie, or so they say, and anyway, who can pore over real life with the same sharp-eyed scrutiny that, in the tranquility of recollection, a photo album allows? On the way back from the D.H. Lawrence Ranch, they all admit they are hungry, and Molly insists on stopping at a roadside cafe instead of driving a bit farther to a place that Evan has read about in one of his travel guides. This is part of the playing it by ear portion of the afternoon. The place is grubby, and the food turns out to be overpriced microwave mush. Evan is sulky, Molly defensive, and Delia withdrawn, trying for once not to take sides, Evan thinks, since Molly's side is so clearly insupportable in this instance. Come on, it's only lunch, Molly says, not the end of the world. After this tacit admission from Molly that she blew it, Evan nods his head agreeably and says the only complimentary thing he can think to say about the meal. The beer is nice and cold. After all, it is only a meal, and he does not really care that much about the restaurant. He just resents his image as the uptight graduate student enslaved to photo and Fromer. He wants it duly noted that playing it by ear does not always get you what you want. The only memorable part of the meal, as far as he is concerned, was the moment when Delia reached across the table with her napkin and pulled a string of cheese off his beard.
Molly was busy talking to a couple at the next table who had daughters about the same ages as Aviva and Chloe and didn't see it. Although he was slightly embarrassed, the gesture struck him as very, very intimate. Back in town, they split up. The women go off to poke through the galleries, and he goes back to the hotel for a swim. The couple from the lousy restaurant are sitting out by the pool while their daughters splash around in the water. Seeing the little girls having such a good time, Evan suddenly misses his own daughters and feels a pang of guilt for not having brought them along, even though they adore staying with his parents who spoil them rotten. His daughters are both blonde, like him, and so fresh and beautiful, like rosebuds, that Evan fears that he will walk into their room one morning and find nothing but two little piles of wilted petals lying in their twin beds. When he comes in from swimming, the bed is littered with shopping bags and Molly is in the shower singing old Linda Ronstadt songs. He nudges the packages to one side and stretches out on the bed. His muscles feel deeply relaxed from all the sun and swimming, but his mind feels tense, tight. He wishes he could reach inside his skull and massage his brain until his choppy brainwaves flatten into gentle ripples. Through a cloud of steam, he sees Delia standing in the shower spray, naked, beckoning to him to join her. He forces his eyes open, flicks on the bright reading light like a splash of cold water, and concentrates on the mandala-like sand painting hanging on the wall opposite the bed. The shower clunks off, and Molly emerges from the steaming bathroom, patting herself dry with a white towel that makes her dark tan appear even darker. God, I'm beat. She sweeps some packages onto the floor and throws herself onto the bed next to him. Did you have a nice swim? He nods. Delia went back to one of the galleries. I told her we'd meet her at Doc Martin's at 8. She rolls over and tugs his beard flirtatiously. I even made reservations. He pats her naked rump. Good girl. He stares up at the ceiling, praying that he will be able to make it through this trip without doing something stupid, something everyone will regret. That really was a wretched dump we had lunch in. She reaches into a bag and pulls out 2 beaded belts that say Taos and 2 t-shirts with coyotes howling at the moon. I got these for the girls. Good. The sight of the little red and blue t-shirts seems to snap him back to himself. Let's call the girls, he says, reaching for the phone. He knows that if he can just hear their voices, everything will be all right. We'll be home tomorrow, and I just called last night. She folds the t-shirts and stuffs them back in the bag. Your mother will think we don't trust her. I just want to hear their voices, he insists. Okay? Molly looks at him sharply as if she is about to say something and then shrugs. He reaches over and grabs the receiver and dials the number. Molly rests her wet head on his chest. Chloe, the 5-year-old, answers on the second ring and launches into a shrill, breathless account of how Tuffy, his parents' old Sheltie, dragged a dead bird into the living room while they were eating pizza. He can feel Molly's laughter tickling his chest hairs. When Chloe runs out of verbal steam, Molly tugs on the phone cord. Let me say hello. He holds the receiver to her mouth. He suddenly feels very companionable, lying in bed naked with his wife talking to their offspring. Wow, Molly gasps appreciatively. That's amazing. Now may I please talk to your sister? Evan winces as Chloe slams the receiver onto the counter and Molly says, ouch. He kisses the top of her head and runs his free hand along the smooth curve of her inner thigh, higher and higher, until she moans slightly and slaps his hand playfully away. This is sick. I'm talking to your daughter. Hey, Vivi, how's it going? Evan raises his voice so his older daughter can hear. Fine, she replies, like the aloof, blasé 8-year-old she has just recently become. I was watching a video, Splash. Tom Hanks sells fruits and vegetables and stuff. Daryl Hannah's a mermaid, and we have to go, sweetie, Molly butts in, knowing that if she doesn't, Aviva will summarize the entire plot in excruciating detail with much backtracking and editorializing. She wants to be a movie reviewer when she grows up. Her favorite game is playing Siskel and Ebert with her best friend, Sage. Molly sighs as she hands him the receiver to hang up. I hope this is a passing phase. Otherwise, she's going to be a real bore at cocktail parties. He laughs and insinuates his hand back between her legs. For the first time since they left home, he feels relaxed, centered, like his old self. This looks serious, she says. Reach out and touch someone. He laughs and pulls her down on top of him. The door next door opens and shuts. Both of them freeze. They listen to Delia moving around, rattling paper, sliding open drawers. Molly reaches over and turns on the clock radio, a weather report. She rotates the dial until she hits some music. Next door, the shower blasts on. They both unfreeze and pick up where they left off. but not quite. The momentum is broken. Something has gone out of it. They are like dancers who have suddenly lost the beat. Dinner at Doc Martin's is a leisurely affair. As far as they can tell, nothing happens in Taos at night. The one movie theater in the plaza is showing something they have already seen, so they eat slowly, noting how delicious it all is. When they trade bites, Evan notices Molly and he trade, and Molly and Delia trade, but he and Delia do not trade, as if this would be too intimate. He can't tell whether Molly notices this or not. After dinner, they order coffee, then brandy. Mostly the two women keep the conversation gently afloat. Every so often he swims in with some comment and then swims away again. He notices a single man at a corner table watching them, the two women, like a dog with his nose pressed to the glass, his eyes full of naked longing. The man is about their age, not bad-looking, dressed in casual but expensive clothes, a lawyer or architect maybe, recently divorced. For a moment, as he starts in on his second brandy, Evan toys masochistically with the idea of inviting the man to join them. Ever since he fell in love with Delia, he's spent a lot of time thinking about the possibility of her meeting some other man. Sometimes, lying in bed next to his wife, he wishes that Delia would fall for someone and soon, before he has a chance to do something stupid. He knows rationally this would be best for everyone. In his fantasy, the four of them become the best of friends, tennis, doubles, dinners at each other's houses, shared vacation condos in Aspen and Maui. But in his dreams, all he feels is misery, rage, murder. Delia yawns and sighs. She stretches, twisting to the right and then to the left. Her breasts rise and shine underneath the gauzy fabric of her dress. I think I'll go read for a while and turn in early, she says. I didn't get much sleep last night. Me neither, he says. Her dark eyes lock with his for an instant and then quickly break away. She sighs again. She looks tired, unhappy, tired of being unhappy. This is part, maybe the main part, he thinks, of what attracts him to her, this shadow of unhappiness. He knows that a smarter man would take this as a warning. What you see is what you get, an unhappy woman. But he, of course, thinks he can be the one to ring the bell, as if this were one of these carnival games where men line up with sledgehammers and pound away with all their male might. He will be the one to smash her unhappiness to smithereens and walk off with the prize. He is the prince in disguise that the sleeping princess has been waiting for all these years. Delia, Delia, let down your hair. Poor Delia, Molly says, watching Delia walk away from them. Evan feels a lick of anger as it suddenly occurs to him, ungenerously, that Molly enjoys feeling sorry for Delia, enjoys going out of her way to appear so very sensitive, enjoys bending over backwards so as not to rub in her advantage as the wife. If he were Delia, he would hate her. He thinks of all the times Molly has urged him to think of someone, one of his musician buddies or tennis partners, to fix Delia up with, as if she were broken, in need of repair. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees the single man at the corner table, the nice-looking, well-dressed one, slap some money down and head toward the front door. In a hurry, Evan thinks. And he has a sudden terrible hunch that the man has a plan. As Molly chatters on about the schedule for tomorrow, their last day in New Mexico, Evan imagines the man waylaying Delia at the corner with some light inconsequential pleasantry, falling into step with her, inviting her for a nightcap in the hotel bar. We have to stop in Rancho de Taos, Molly is saying. We have to see the San Francisco de Asís church, if nothing else. Evan nods, not really listening. He is remembering the moment he realized that his feelings for Delia had changed. Molly had been after him for weeks to fix Delia up with his friend Jack. Just invite him to dinner, Molly had said. Don't say anything about Delia. We'll have the Narvisons over too, so it won't look like so much of a setup. But when Evan finally got around to inviting Jack, a notorious womanizer, Jack, as if smelling a trap, asked if he could bring along a date. Thrown for a loop, Evan had thought about just saying yes, but instead he spilled the beans to Jack about Delia. To hell with female subterfuge. Jack was skittish, dubious. He didn't want any part of it, and Evan found himself launching into a hard sell. When he had finished waxing eloquent about Delia's charms, Jack had laughed and said, "Maybe you should go out with her. You sound like you've got a bad case." "Don't be ridiculous," Evan had snapped back. Jack just smiled skeptically, eyebrows raised, and said, "Thanks, but I think I'll pass." And suddenly Evan felt as if he had been granted a stay of execution. Later, as they were walking to their cars in the parking lot, Jack spanked Evan's rear with his racket and said, "Don't do anything I wouldn't do," and winked. After that, Evan had avoided Jack, making excuses until Jack finally stopped calling. Molly set down her empty brandy glass and pats his hand on the white tablecloth. "Let's go," she says. "You seem tired. Are you all right?" "Fine." He downs the last of his brandy. "Why wouldn't I be?" He stares at her, as if daring her to continue, his heart pounding. She looks across the table at him, her jaw set, eyes narrowed, her expression like a clenched fist ready to strike out. Now, he thinks, now, bracing himself for the first blow, now. But her eyes slide away from his, and her expression relaxes into a blank smile addressed to no one in particular. He feels simultaneously let off the hook and let down. She stands up and slings her handbag over her shoulder. "Coming?" Outside, the evening air is surprisingly cool. Molly shivers and Evan puts his arm around her shoulder and pulls her toward him as they make their way back to the hotel. The stream of traffic has dwindled to a trickle, and the night seems almost peaceful. The dark shape of the mountain squats in the distance. The wine and the brandy have dulled his nerves. He thinks maybe he will be able to sleep tonight. But as they cross the hotel lobby past the cocktail lounge, Molly nudges him in the ribs and says, "Look." He looks over into the dim interior of the bar and sees Delia sitting at a small round table with the man from the restaurant. Although Evan has imagined this very scenario, it comes now as a total shock, like a wave of icy water. Delia's back is to him, so he can't read her expression. She doesn't see them, although the man looks up, and Evan sees the click of recognition in his eyes. He waits for the man to say, "There are your friends," and for Delia to turn and wave, but the man apparently says nothing of the sort. "Want to join them?" Evan says. Molly laughs. "I don't think she needs us." She links her arm through his, shepherding him toward their room. In the darkness, lying next to Molly, who is out like a light, Evan checks the luminous dial of his watch every few minutes, wondering what they are doing. Now the man is paying the bill. Now they are strolling towards his hotel room. Later he hears voices, male and female, murmuring in the hallway, Delia's muffled laugh. He has all he can do to keep himself from flinging open the door and ordering Delia inside like an angry father or a jealous husband. But what right does he have to do such a thing? So he just lies there, jaw clenched, not daring to breathe, until he hears a door open and shut and the thud of footsteps padding off down the hall. He imagines the sound of water running in the sink as Delia brushes her teeth, more musical than Handel's water music. In the hallway, right outside his door, the footsteps pause for a long moment and then continue on. Smiling to himself in the dark, Evan feels almost sorry for the guy. The plan is to stop at St. Francisco de Asís Church in Rancho de Taos, drive down to Santa Fe for lunch, and continue on to the airport in Albuquerque. After a rushed breakfast in the hotel coffee shop, they settle their bill and load their bags into the trunk of the Ford. As usual, Molly drives and he sits in the back seat, skimming the guidebook. Delia's long hair is caught up in a neat ponytail, exposing her bare neck, which is paler than the rest of her, more vulnerable looking. Evan dares to reach out and tuck in the label of her t-shirt, which is sticking up. The two women discuss a design project they are both going to be working on when they return home. Evan wants to ask about the man in the bar, but doesn't trust himself to strike the appropriately casual, big brotherly tone. The ride to Rancho de Taos is short. When they pull into the dirt parking lot, the church takes him by surprise. Although he has thumbed through an entire book of paintings of the church and the hotel gift shop, its simple beauty seems fresh and pure in the early morning light. His spirits lift. As the three of them make their way across the dusty lot toward the church, Molly unscrews the lens cap of her camera and hands it to Evan to put in his pocket for safekeeping. "I'd like to see the mystery painting," Evan says, pausing by the parish office. "I've read about it." They look at Delia, who nods agreeably. "They're supposed to have a little slideshow and everything," he says. "Okay," Molly shrugs. "Why don't you two go see it and I'll meet you at the church?" "You're not interested?" Delia asks. "I've already seen it," Molly says, "but you two should go. It's definitely worth seeing." Molly walks on ahead, and the guide ushers Evan and Delia inside to a small viewing room with folding chairs lined up in rows. They are the only ones in the room. The guide asks them where they are from and whether they have any children. When Evan says 2 daughters, the guide nods and smiles at Delia, assuming that she is the mother. After a couple of minutes of stiff small talk, the man glances at his watch and says it is time to begin. He walks over and switches off the lights. For a moment, the room is pitch black. Then the first slide lights up the screen. The familiar voice of educational film strips tells them the history of the church as the slides click on and off a tad too slowly, leaving just enough time between images for boredom to set in. They learn how adobe bricks are made. They learn who painted the retablos and that the parish has undertaken the arduous task of restoration. Like a little kid waiting for the magic act to begin, Evan shifts restlessly in his uncomfortable chair, anxious to get to the part about the mystery painting. Finally, after what seems like hours, a slide of the painting flashes on the screen. Beside him, in the darkness, he can feel Delia snap to attention as the narrator launches into his droning explanation of the painting's mystery. What makes this painting so unusual, the narrator says, is the fact that although in daylight it portrays the barefoot Christ on a shore in Galilee, in complete darkness the portrait becomes luminescent. The figure seems to become three-dimensional, and a cross appears over the left shoulder of Jesus. The narrator goes on to say that eminent scientists from all over the world have studied the painting, subjecting it to chemical analysis and Geiger counter tests, but no scientific explanation has ever been found for the portrait's marvelous luminosity. At this point, the slideshow ends, and the guide invites the two of them to step forward to view the actual painting. In the darkness, the guide's gentle, disembodied voice tells them to be patient. Their eyes will need a few minutes to adjust. He says that although some people see the phenomenon very clearly, other people have difficulty seeing it, which makes Evan strain his eyes in the dark as if this were some test that he is determined to pass. The guide steps discreetly out of the room, leaving them to experience this religious miracle in privacy. It feels eerie, spooky, standing there alone in the dark silence, which both of them seem reluctant to break. Then, just as he is convinced that nothing is going to happen, the background begins to take on a strange glow. The figure seems to come forward, and he sees it, the dark shadow of the cross. He is surprised, considering how irreligious he is, to feel the hairs tingling on the back of his neck, and at the same moment Delia reaches for his hand. The image is not steady. It pulses in and out of focus, teasingly. Delia rests her head against his chest, and he wraps his arms around her. When she presses against him, he feels a glow spreading through him, like the mysterious glow of the painting. "Oh, God," she says miserably, "God damn it, what the hell are we going to do?" As if rebuking her profanity, the guide bustles back into the room and flicks on the overhead light. Heart pounding, palms sweating, Evan blinks in the sudden bright glare. Delia takes a circumspect step away from him and fishes her dark glasses out of her purse. Standing there in front of the blank screen, he feels as if they are characters in some corny old B-movie. He can't think of anything to say that doesn't sound like some hack wrote it, despite the fact that he still feels the glow burning inside him, where it is dark and safe. On the way out, Evan drops a $5 bill into the offering box. Blinking in the bright sunshine, they make their way slowly across the dirt parking lot to the church, not saying anything, threading their way through the handful of dusty cars with out-of-state plates. "There she is," Delia says, pointing. Molly waves and smiles. She is standing in the courtyard of the church in front of a tall wooden cross. "How was it?" she says, walking toward them. "Did you see it?" She hums the theme from the Twilight Zone and laughs. "I saw it," Delia says. "Pretty weird." Evan just nods. "Really? You really saw it?" Molly's smile fades, and she looks so wistful that Evan rests his hand lightly on her shoulder. "I never saw it," she says. "I couldn't see a damn thing." "It was pretty fuzzy," Delia says consolingly. "It was probably all in our heads, some sort of hypnotic suggestion." Molly shrugs, squinting into the viewfinder, taking a couple of steps backward and adjusting the focus. "You two stand over there," she orders, "in front of the cross." "Just what the world needs," Evan says with a sigh, "another picture of this church." But he obediently trudges over and stands next to Delia. "Such a martyr." Molly shakes her head at him through the viewfinder. "Move closer together." Evan hesitates and then takes a step sideways and boldly puts his arm around Delia's waist. He feels her stiffen, and then after a moment's hesitation, she puts her arm around his waist. "That's good," Molly nods. Beside him, Delia lets out a sigh. "Now, do you think you could manage a smile?" Evan frowns and glares at Molly. For a moment he hates her for being so hopelessly dense, so willfully blind. And as the camera shutter clicks, he has a fantasy, a wild hope, that when the picture is developed, this passion that feels to him so palpable will miraculously have taken shape on the negative, some dark shadow of love that defies the scientist's explanation and his own faint-hearted denials. Now, he thinks, bracing himself, now.
This new collection, The Summer Before the Summer of Love, which is the title of one of the stories in the book. And I had a really hard time coming up with a title for that story. I often do. It's like either a title occurs to you or it doesn't. And I just thought and thought that finally I came up with that, and I didn't like it at all, but then it just sort of grew on me, and then it ended up being the title story. Several of these stories in the book are written from a male point of view, and I know a lot of writers that think that that is a big hurdle. Oh, I could never write a story from a male point of view, and I may be just naive. I just don't think about it. I just do it, and I guess I basically believe there's more similarities than differences way down deep. And so it would depend on the gender, the level of education of my character, the region they're from. Sometimes I do hear a voice in my head, especially with first-person stories, and that's what carries me through. I write because I like to read so much, and I've been kind of dismayed, and I know some of my colleagues have felt the same way, that we've encountered a lot of students recently who like to write but don't like to read, which seems contradictory. If you're going to write, you should read what other people have written, I think. And I think I like this, the kind of state of mind you go in, or I go in when I write. Teaching is helpful because it makes me think about my writing, and makes me think hard about it, because I don't care how many years you do it, even in the beginning classes, these different questions or problems will come up every time, and I'll just think, gosh, I don't know what to say about this. This doesn't seem quite right, but it's really hard to put my finger on it. So it really makes you think hard about what makes something work or not work. And beyond that, I do a lot of, or I try to make people see that TV, a lot of stuff they see on TV and movies, is not necessarily the best, most truthful kind of art. A lot of students, the younger students, have been very influenced by very melodramatic, very action-oriented plots. So we spend a lot of time talking about why those aren't really the best plots for short stories. At the very least, I hope they come out of the class better readers, more sensitive readers.